So I guess Pat left it off right around the point where we were ready to launch this project, and we had put a lot of time and effort in working with the Department of Revenue and scoping this out and working with other state agencies to kind of get a feel for how this project would be used long-term in the state. And one of the major questions we get asked, well, first we'll talk about what the Mosaic really would be. On an annual basis, we were charged with inventorying all the assessing records or collecting that information, and then providing a representation of ownership or a cadastral map. The Department of Revenue was not concerned with a survey grade map. They said we need to understand where every property is roughly located and what the value of that property is. People always say, why do you call it a mosaic? When I think of a mosaic, I think of tile artwork like we see when we walk in every day to the conference, or the facade of a building in the Middle East maybe. But the reason we call it a mosaic is because at its fundamental level, a mosaic takes smaller pieces and creates a larger picture, which was our goal with the Mosaic parcel map. Take these individual parcel maps and compile them to create a larger picture that gives us a more general understanding of how this information is being used across the state. And the reason we use Mosaic is also because usually the tiles don't fit together perfectly. You might have town boundaries that don't line up quite as well as we'd hope. You might have some gores between towns. But every year we rebuild this data set from scratch, and that enables us to create a tighter, better fitting mosaic as we work with the different data providers and explain to them the issues we're finding with their information, and we try to go through that iterative process to create a better picture of what's going on with land records in New Hampshire. So we're going to talk about some of the philosophies we use in this project. As Pat said, we're kind of the Wild West of GIS in New Hampshire. We don't have a lot of structure, so we were left somewhat to our own devices to determine what was the best way to execute a project of this magnitude. The first is understanding the data environment. Determining the baseline data. When you talk about 235 taxing jurisdictions, you need to understand what the lowest common denominator of information is so that you have a uniform layer of information across that 235 jurisdictions. Developing an integration plan. Once you understand what's out there and what you're going to collect, you have to figure out how you're actually going to put it together. Determine how you're going to disseminate and share that information. Pat showed a video from Manchester, New Hampshire, and their web application. And that's the future of GIS, so those light web applications. You know, throughout the conference, I've heard people talking about how do you sell these projects to either your client, your superior, your select board, your city council. Giving them the tools they need to use the information and make decisions, whether they're financial, planning-based, whatever, is critical. You have to be able to put the information in the hands of people who are not the GIS power users. This is probably the one most GIS professionals don't think about. You need to develop a public relations plan. You need to get out in front of a large project like this and explain to people what your goal is. Especially when you're working with the Department of Revenue Administration, people think there's some clandestine use for the information and Big Brother is after them. And then you have to plan for sustainability, and we'll go through each of these topics one by one in a second. Then probably the most difficult piece of the project philosophies is actually executing. Once you put together a plan, that's great, but you actually have to follow through and make it come to life. So understanding the data environment. In New Hampshire, we have very specific RSAs that require parcel map data and CAM information to be updated at certain times throughout the year. When we talk about parcel data, the RSAs require that the parcels are maintained to April 1st of every year. Usually that means that people don't start thinking about updating that parcel data until July 1st or so. And we still have some municipalities that are still in the process currently of updating their data for April 1st of 2013. CAMA data is a little more rigid. September 1st is usually the day that everyone has their data updated because that leads to the tax rate setting process. And as Pat indicated, that's the lifeblood of New Hampshire's economy, or at least the local government economy. So they're usually very on top of making sure that data is submitted. So for our project, we determined we'd have a solicitation season of roughly August through February. So from August to February of every year, we compile the Mosaic parcel map, which is why you might have seen us running back and forth to our hotel room because we've been getting calls and data being fired in at us the entire time we've been here. And people don't like to hear you're at a conference and you can't look at their information at the moment. So in New Hampshire, we have approximately 50 data maintainers around the state, whether they're RPCs, private companies like CAI Technologies that Pat mentioned, but about 90% of our parcel count in New Hampshire is covered by GIS data or automated parcel data. Another 7% is AutoCAD, and typically those are georeference composite AutoCAD maps, so they lend themselves to GIS conversion. And then another 3% or so are paper maps. And Pat and I have been working to eradicate those from the state. We've been working on another project to digitize the majority of those towns. The paper data in New Hampshire you see in many of the smaller municipalities out west and up north. As Pat indicated, that's more away from the population density of the state. CAMA data is more varied. We have about 6 systems in place in New Hampshire. There's a new one coming in, so it'll soon be 7. But there are 2 primary systems that are being utilized. One is Vision, which is being used around the country. Another one is called Avatar. They have about 34% of the state. That's a local system, only used in New Hampshire, and is only really valuable for small municipalities under 3,000 parcels with primarily residential property. So we have a pretty good scattershot of information going on. The amazing thing is that every municipality uses a CAMA system. When we started the project, we had one municipality that was still using an Excel spreadsheet to maintain their assessing records, but they have since converted over. We talk about the County Registry of Deeds. The deeds are completely fragmented from the rest of the state. They're run by the counties. And the counties in New Hampshire were granted by the King of England before the country was even founded. So they are completely independent of the state government or the local government. The counties are completely autonomous. And all deeds are registered through their individual counties. There are 3 systems being used in New Hampshire to register those deeds. Most of them have the same fundamental core information, though. So after we evaluated what the data environment was in New Hampshire, we determined what's the baseline information that we're going to go out and collect every year from these different entities. We talk about CAMA data. Pat talked before about the level of detail we like to acquire. So roughly what we're talking about is a parcel identifier, an address, detailed owner information, including their mailing address, land use, zoning information, land area, structure information, and this is very important, and it's being used for a number of other projects. The structure information is very valuable, and as Pat said, we get down to the roof cladding and building cladding, but this is a basic list of what we collect. The year built, bedroom count, bathroom count, condition, and grade, which are drivers for assessing systems. And then we get some advanced information, a full breakdown of the assessed value, and all previous sale information that's logged into the CAMA database. When we talk about spatial information, what do we collect from each of these municipalities? Well, from a GIS perspective, parcel polygons, obviously, those are the drivers of our system. Building footprints, if they're available, road right-of-way, and any water features, whether they're polygon or line features. When it comes to AutoCAD, like I said, the majority of the municipalities are maintaining a composite AutoCAD map. We do have some that maintain AutoCAD sheet maps that are non-georeferenced, which create a little bit more of a headache for us. And then paper maps. We collect PDF images or TIFF images, but there have been many times where a map tube has showed up on my desk that was mailed to me, so we had to go in and then scan those documents. We had one municipality that was maintaining 24 by 36 paper maps with a Bic round stick. That was their method of maintaining their data. And when we talk about the registries of deeds, we're looking for basic information from their index, the transfer date, the price, book page, grantor, grantee, tax stamp amounts. So now we've evaluated the data environment, developed a baseline level of information that we're trying to collect from all these different entities. We have to then develop an integration plan. How are we going to bring all this information together into a single data set? And as I said, we do this on an annual basis. We don't collect the information once and then maintain it ourselves as the changes come through. We recollect every municipality's data set and recompile every year using standardized processes. So what we had to determine was what information exists and develop a process to accept that and export a repeatable result, whether that meant slightly converting a town or rotating it, scaling it, maybe doing a data conversion, bringing it from AutoCAD into GIS, and then bringing all that information together and converting it into a uniform format. So Pat kind of talked briefly about the methodology we used. We use a composite polygon layer with a relational CAMA database. And if you're speaking about CAMA information, you need to be looking at a relational database. You have to have that ability to connect one-to-one records, which are pretty common, or many-to-one records, where you see with condos, mobile homes, etc. We do have a unique situation in New Hampshire with the way the RSAs are written regarding boat docks. You own a right to a boat slip, so that creates a situation where you have many-to-many records, but that's a very isolated situation. Another method we had to employ in this project, because we have no GIO, we have no state standards, we had to collect whatever spatial information a municipality had, whether they were hand-drawn paper maps or they were full GIS composite maps. So when we talk about paper parcel maps, how did we deal with those? We collect the information, we geo-reference it, and then we clip the white space out, basically creating a composite image. We then overlay a polygon index on that image and connect assessing records to it. So what you have there is somewhere between 10 and 100 parcels tied to a single polygon. It's not the best method, but it's highly repeatable, and we have very known results when we go through that process. AutoCAD maps are a little different. We will take sheet maps and geo-reference them and compile them into a composite, or we will take existing composites, strip out all of the line work or all the boundary representations, but then we need to determine how are you going to connect this assessing information to the map. And there's only one piece of information on that AutoCAD map that you can tie back to the camera records, and that's the annotation. So we convert the annotation to a small point, we buffer that into a small polygon, and then we have a uniform polygon layer to connect that CAM information to. Once again, these methods are fairly rudimentary. If we were collecting the information once and maintaining it, we would convert all these towns over. But because we collect this information every year, we have to develop these processes that are repeatable with known results. So the registries of deeds, they're a little bit different. How do we deal with their information? Well, in New Hampshire, you go to the registry with your deed, they take that, they scan it, and then they index some basic information so the public can go log into a website and pull up those images later on. And they get stored in two different databases. They take an image database, which they scan the document and store, and then they have an index database. The images are a source of revenue for the counties. They charge people to print those deeds, and they charge, in some cases, for access to the information. So we were not able to develop a plan with them to get images, but we do, on a weekly basis, through FTP transfer, receive all the index information. So within a week of a real estate transfer, that comes into our system, and we then have a complete picture of the new owners involved in that with the parcel. Pat talked about how we were working with the Department of Revenue Administration, and we were lucky enough to develop a new project with them to redevelop the real estate transfer tax documents. So every time you purchase a property in New Hampshire, you need to file two things: a declaration of real estate transfer, which is a tax return, which is a confidential document, and an inventory of real estate transfer, which is a public document that basically states everything that's on your tax return minus your EIN. So we've redeveloped those forms into web forms that you can download an Adobe PDF, fill it out, and then it will submit XML data directly to our system. And there's a certain section of the form where they ask for the real estate information. What parcel did you purchase? What we developed is a lookup. So the user enters the town and rough address information. That makes a call back to a redacted database in our system that brings back results. What it does is seed a couple basic fields on the form, but what the user does not see, what's going on behind the scenes, is we're embedding the map ID to the form before it's even come to our system. So before this form leaves the user's computer, we've already pinned that to the parcel map. So we're roughly in real time connecting this real estate transfer tax information to our parcel map, getting a complete picture of the real estate movement throughout the state. Then we have to look at how are we going to share this information out with the users. We have two different methods that we use: a web platform and a web mapping service. When we started working with the Department of Revenue, they had 0 ArcMap licenses. They had one license of 3.2, which they were kind of nursing along going through the process. So we developed two methods for them: a web platform that has about 60 users of the Department of Revenue. You're probably thinking that's not a lot of users. The Department of Revenue has 115 employees, so over half the department's using this system on a regular basis. The web mapping service was designed for power users. The regional planning commissions really asked for that to do the broadband mapping project. We serve that information out to them. So we developed a web mapping service that actually has information behind it. The Department of Revenue asked us not to use a feature service for that. So our web platform, very basic, but as I said, when you're trying to get information into the hands of people who are not power users, it's critical they have an easy system that they can access. You know, whether you're just zooming into the map and geographically locating a property, or you're searching through the assessing database looking for any commercial property that may have waterfront that may be over a certain amount of acreage. So this system is deployed to about 300 users around New Hampshire in various state agencies. And we see people from the Aeronautics Division to DES to the Department of Safety. And this application is served out to all of them. And they get detailed property information at their fingertips. We also use the web mapping service like I talked about. That's a little bit more restrictive than a feature source would be. The Department of Revenue asked us not to develop a feature source so people couldn't start extracting information out of it. But the web mapping service does allow the user to select a parcel and pull up that relational CAMA database information. As you can see here, it's just loading up. This is all real-time. This is real-time loading. And then when the user strikes a parcel, they're able to see any records that are tied to it, whether it's one or many. So who are we serving this information out to? Well, we have the web app. Obviously, we serve it out to our primary user, the Department of Revenue information. The Department of Revenue has signed memorandums of understanding with many other state agencies: transportation, safety, National Guard, economic and resource development. And we serve the information out to them. Like I said, we have about 300 users around the state when you take DRA and then all the other state agencies together. Launching in about 2 weeks will be the sharing pool. We'll be sharing this information back to municipalities for their use. It'll be for use of municipal administrators. One of the biggest drivers of this is common assessing needs, common planning needs. So they will have the same access to information that the state does. Not only their own information, but all of their neighbors. Then on the other side of the project, of course, we have the web mapping service, which we push out to the regional planning commissions and a number of state agencies who had power user needs like DES. They wanted to be able to interface with this information in their own proprietary systems and with their own information that they didn't feel comfortable releasing to other agencies. So now this is the daunting task for a lot of people in this industry, I know, is developing a PR plan. It's really critical that your client knows what you're doing, but does the public know what you're doing? Do other people in your organization know what you're doing? Do you have a clear picture of what your plan is? And we like to say public relations is where Marketing Avenue and Strategy Street intersect. You need to get that clear message out to them. So you need a strong web presence. If you're doing a project and you put it into Google and search and you're not the top result, you need to do a better job with search engine optimization. That's critical. The first thing anyone does now when they're looking at a new topic is Google it. So you have to be sure that you're optimizing your search engine results. And then we had a great keynote yesterday regarding social media. It's important to have different groups out there and yourself tweeting about what you're doing. Get out there in the public sphere. Publishing. You have to get out there and write articles, whether it's a local magazine like Town and City in New Hampshire. We did a great article with IAO Fair and Equitable this year, and local newspapers reporting on the project. You just have to get out there. Your public relations plan is never going to stop people from criticizing you or complaining about your project, but at least it gives you an idea of how to get in front of it and how to have a clear, concise message to those users. You need to present at different conferences, whether they're local or a larger conference like we are today. It's important to get the message out to the other people in your industry so they know what you're doing, they can learn from the lessons that you've gone through, and maybe pick up something new through your presentation. This is probably the most embarrassing part of your PR plan. You have to apply for awards. I'll tell you what awards we've applied for and won. I'm going to admit what awards we've applied for and not won. We were designated a bright idea by the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. That's a local program, or a national program actually, that looks in every state to identify bright ideas and up-and-coming technology projects. So now you have to think about sustainability. And I know sustainability is a buzzword these days, and obviously the first thing that comes to mind with sustainability is you need the money to keep a project going. But when I talk about sustainability, I'm talking about data sustainability. And that's bringing in the information in different intervals to ensure that you have a complete picture of what's going on. So in our case with Mosaic, we talked about getting transfer documents on a daily basis from the users. The registry information on a weekly basis from all the different registries of deeds. The CAMA data, which for a lot of municipalities comes on a semi-annual basis. Some choose to only do it once a year. We have some people that have sent us CAMA data up to 15 times throughout the year. And then parcel map information. 99% of the time we're getting that on an annual basis. Some municipalities do update their information in somewhat real time, and they do provide it to us more regularly. Now, this is probably the hardest part. You actually have to execute your project. It's great when Pat and I sit in the room and we develop our plan, but then we actually have to get out and put it together. So we started this project in 2010. And the first go-around, we said we're going to just go to every municipality, ask for the information, and if they don't want to give it to us or ask us to go in front of their cranky select board, we're going to go to the next one. So using that methodology, we picked up about 177 taxing jurisdictions, or 570,000 out of the 680,000 records throughout the state. We were very happy with that as a first take. Our client was ecstatic. They thought we were going to get the door slammed in our face so many times that my nose would be sideways. The second edition worked pretty much the same way, except we would go to a lot more meetings and we had a lot more momentum behind the project. We brought together 227 taxing jurisdictions. We had a few municipalities who still were fighting with the Department of Revenue on other issues, so they were not about to support one of their other initiatives. And we had some municipalities that were in system conversions, mostly out west. The most recent edition that ended this past June, we brought in 100% of the data in the state. Right now, we're in the middle of the solicitation that started on August 15th, and we have roughly 350,000 records into the system already. So we anticipate that this year we'll have 235 taxing jurisdictions come together. Talk about the speed of the record collection. We talked about edition 1, how we had to go out and really beg, borrow, and steal to get the data. And it took a lot longer. If you look at the x-axis of this graph, it's working days from the start of the edition of that map. You can see in yellow, the most recent edition, we collected almost all of the data in under 100 days. So we were able to ratchet up the speed with which we collected the information. Now, parcel data is a little bit tougher to collect. In every municipality, they know how to export their assessing data. It's usually 1 or 2 clicks and they can have a report out, email it to you. Spatial information is a little trickier. So in edition 1, we had about 389,000 out of the 600,000 records in the state. Edition 2, we started doing much better. We had 225 records, or 225 taxing jurisdictions, excuse me. And then the most recent edition, we had 233. So we just had 2 people that were still holding out, and they really weren't holdouts. They had some data conversion issues. Some of them were in the midst of multiple year projects to bring their spatial data up to grade. So we collected about 570,000 records last year. We've already collected about 250,000 records this year, so we're well on pace, I think, to wrap up the state in this upcoming year with 235 jurisdictions. Parcel map collection, like I said, is not as easy. So you can see that the working days from the start of the edition on the third edition didn't ramp up as highly as they did with the assessing information, but we anticipate that that will kind of change as time goes on. And really what this speaks to is, if you're going to do a large-scale project in a state whose motto is live free or die, you have to expect that you have to get momentum behind you before everyone gets on board. So what is the state using this for? We obviously know the Department of Revenue has a huge interest in overseeing the assessing practices throughout the state. But public safety, they were one of the first people to knock on our door and ask for access to it. They've integrated into their E911 system, the Emergency Operations Center, and they actually have hard copy information which they have loaded into their system, which is now in every state trooper's vehicle and will soon be in every local police vehicle. You think, why would a local police officer or a state trooper want access to parcel data? If there's a crime on a property and they need to speak with the owner, we've heard multiple stories of the police chief or the local police chief breaking into his own town hall to pull up the assessing records from their system. So getting that information into the hands of police officers is very valuable. Transportation planning. The DOT does a ton of different projects around the state. Project abutter notification is a huge issue for them. They travel, they have, I think, a 15-person team that's constantly traveling around the state just to abstract information on project abutter notification. They're doing preliminary layout of highway design now, environmental impact studies, safe rides to school, a lot of different projects the DOT is using. They have about 75 users of the system right now. Environmental protection, wellhead protection, nitrogen loading, which you might not think of. Bathroom count is very valuable to DES because that lets them extrapolate out the potential nitrogen loading. And in New Hampshire, in our Great Bay, we have some nitrogen issues, which EPA and DES are very concerned with. So this gives them a better picture of what's happening. Regional planning. One of the big drivers is the broadband mapping project. All the RPCs are involved in that. We provide them information so they understand what the parcels are and the land use behind those. Economic development. We have an economic development department in New Hampshire, which is referred to as DREAD, which they are in the process of trying to figure out a new acronym for themselves. But it's very critical. If you have a large box store looking to come and do business in your state or a large factory, they want to know if you have parcels in certain towns, certain counties that meet that have a certain acreage, maybe a certain pre-classified land use or zoning requirement, access to highways, access to our shipping ports along the seacoast. So that's critical. And of course, local assessing has had a huge impact. The sharing pool, the property tax equalization system we've developed as well. I could rattle on for about 3 hours, so if you want to find me after this, we can talk about all kinds of different uses. But think about this. The last thing that came up on the screen was the COOP, or the continuity of operations. If you were an assessor in Colorado and your office now just got washed away, does someone else have a copy of your information? Are you holding your information off-site with a third party? If you're not, this is critical, because now any municipality who has issues in their town and maybe has lost contact with their data can now recoup it from us through this project. So we talk about a national land base. This is the direction everything's going. We're not the only state that's embarked upon a project like this. There are many other states around the country that have reached the level we're at or are moving towards that level, and you have states like Montana that already have a statewide composite because they maintain that data at a statewide level to begin with. So can we continue that data updraft? Pat talked about how larger data sets like road networks and orthophotography are downdrafted and then cut up for their specific use. But can we continue that updraft of local parcel data to the federal level? We have about 150 million parcels in the United States. And if you ask Pierce and we go to the sub-parcel level, we could be talking about 300 or 400 million parcels. 4,300 taxing jurisdictions around the state when you consider the small towns in New England, the counties in the rest of the state, and then obviously Montana going to statewide level. So that's a lot of different jurisdictions, and Pat talked about baking a pie one slice at a time. That's a gigantic pie. You're talking about 4,300 different pieces. So I just want to touch on a couple quick articles that have been written on this topic in the past year. HUD came out with a report early in 2013 identifying the feasibility of developing a national land database. And they compiled 109 of 127 target counties, mostly in population centers. And they attempted to estimate a cost and effort for developing a national parcel map. And they also did an analysis of the different data integration methods that could be used to build that national parcel data set. So this is a map of the actual counties they went out and collected, and you can see they focused on all the population centers. Southern California, Colorado, Denver area, Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. But we see a lot of areas they did not cover. And it's important that we cover those population centers, but we also have to think about the large part of this country that's rural, like northern New Hampshire, like the northwest part of this country. So they brought together 109 of those target communities. And then they looked at two different aggregation models. The national aggregation model, where 4,300 different data maintainers feed their data up to the national level, and the federal government is charged with compiling that information together. Then there is also the state aggregation model, which is what we did in New Hampshire, where the states actually aggregate their own information together and feed that up to the national level. So you're talking about 50 states, Puerto Rico, the tribal territories, and federal lands being pushed up to a national aggregator. And what the article identified, and which I wholeheartedly agree with, is that the national aggregation model doesn't work. You have to have each state aggregating their own data, because I don't think anyone else could come into New Hampshire that wasn't from there and understand the live free or die mentality and make it through a project like this. We all understand our own states like no one else can. Then there was a nice article that came out very recently in the Fair and Equitable magazine, IAO's magazine, about building a national parcel data set. Brent Jones and Nancy Von Meyer did this one. They looked at the FGDC cadastral subcommittee and all the work they've been doing to push this agenda forward. They did a 12 states best practices review, and New Hampshire wasn't included. I've already complained to Brent about that one. And they talked about one of the critical things. What are the business drivers in ROI? Developing a national parcel map is not going to be a low-cost endeavor. And we have to be able to prove as an industry that this is a valuable asset for not only all the states, but the federal government, whether it's Homeland Security, resource management, any of those things. So in that article, they had a great schematic of the different levels of stewardship around the state, and I suggest that you go out and read the article, and it talks about what all the different states are doing and where they're at with their parcel projects. And Brent told me yesterday there are 28 states around the country that are working on some kind of state aggregation of parcels. And that's really exciting for someone that's obviously very passionate about parcel data. And they also did some nice metrics over the past decade of where we've been with the number of parcels throughout the state and the number of digital parcels. You're talking about 92% of the nation has digital parcel data. We should be compiling that. There's no reason we can't be compiling that information. And you see that they've outlined 40 states with some level of parcel map program, but around 30 have really moved to the point of having a state parcel map. So the time's now. Like I said, with 92% of the country with automated or digital parcels, the time is now to aggregate all of these different states together into a national parcel map. And that's really where I think the future of the land records cadastral industry is going, is developing that composite land base. And that's where I'll leave it today, but before I go, Wendy will kill me if I don't put a plug in for the great convention that's coming up in February in Jacksonville, the GIS and CAMA Technologies Conference. If you haven't been before, I really suggest going. It's a great audience, great group, really passionate group of people that maintain parcel data and are interested in that kind of cadastral data. So we hope to see everyone in Jacksonville. I'll be there, and Patrick will be there as well. And with that, we'll wrap it up.